So, are you taking part in the boycott?
Yes.
How did you get involved? How did you hear about it?
It all started in December 1955, and I heard about it throughout the community.
What started the boycott?
Well, an African American would not give up her seat to a white passenger.
How does that appeal to you?
Local laws dictate that African American passengers sat at the back of the bus while whites sat in the front.
How long are you willing to keep this up, do you think?
As long as it takes.
On August 24, 1955, Emmett Till, age 14, was brutally murdered in Money, Mississippi for flirting with a white woman 4 days earlier. It is said that Emmett went in to buy some candy and on his way out said, "Bye, baby," and allegedly grabbed her and made catcalls at her while walking out. There were no witnesses but the white woman herself, Carolyn Bryant. Roy Bryant, Carolyn's husband, demanded to see Emmett and forced him into their car. It is said that they beat young Till in a tool house and drove him down to the Tallahatchie River, where his dead body was found 3 days later. The body was unrecognizable except for the initialed ring that made it able to identify Till's body.
Brown versus Board of Education, a case that influenced the civil rights movements and was a landmark Supreme Court case taking place in 1954, which would change education in a time of civil rights turmoil across the nation. It was a case in which the concerns of the fairness of the separate but equal clause should be in place for education of children. Before that, Plessy versus Ferguson was a previous Supreme Court case which allowed for civilities to be separate but equal, yet they were never truly equal, only separate, with schools often being widely unfair and not up to the standards of white schools. The case at hand started in 1951 when Brown filed a lawsuit versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, when his daughter, Linda Brown, was denied access to one of the school district's all-white elementary schools. Brown claimed that the segregation of public education was a violation of the 14th Amendment, in which states cannot deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection under the laws. The case would go before the U.S. District Court in Kansas, which then they would agree that the public school segregation had a detrimental effect upon the colored children and contributed to a sense of inferiority, but still upheld the separate but equal doctrine. The name of Brown v. Board of Education came from 4 separate combined cases that all entered the Supreme Court. In the decisions issued on May 17, 1954, Chief Warren Justice wrote that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place, as segregated schools are inherently unequal. As a result, the court ruled that the plaintiffs were being deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Brown v. Board of Education not only changed the way the education system in America views the segregation and Jim Crow laws that were in place, but many other unfair treatments happening in everyday life. The case would help lead the way in changing the social injustice and norm of America at the time. It would help set up the questioning of the laws that were currently in place and the rules and regulations against African Americans in the 1960s America, during the time of the Civil Rights Movement. It was an event in the Civil Rights Movement that got a lot of national attention and helped the movement gain attention overall. The case would be followed by the Little Rock Nine and thus again add to the attention in the U.S. and the unfair treatment of African Americans would be brought to life.
The March on Washington is one of the largest peaceful protests in American history. It was held outside the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963 to protest the enforcement of Jim Crow laws and segregation. The United States had been segregated since right after post-Civil War Reconstruction ended, and the March on Washington was a protest organized by Martin Luther King Jr., where he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. This was one of the most influential speeches in American history and paved the way for a truly equal America. African Americans were not the only group to be oppressed in the 1950s. Women during World War II proved that they could handle men's work, but after the men came home from the war, they were demoted back to unequal pay and being housewives first and foremost. Women were viewed as dainty and no longer could get hard jobs or administrative jobs. On the streets and in the workplace, it was viewed as normal to harass women, and she couldn't complain to her boss without being viewed as a killjoy at best, or fired, or something much worse. Women were also banned from participating in many organizations, like NASA, or entering the military, until protests for equal rights in the late 1960s led to change.
Now, you're one of the astronauts, I believe?
Yes.
You weren't part of NASA. This was all privately funded.
Yeah, NASA only accepts men in their program, which is unfair. Everyone's equal under the Constitution, and I thought we settled the whole women can't do men's work debate when we did in World War II, when they all were off.
So how were you selected?
We all were pilots. The project founders figured that we'd be most adaptable to flying space shuttles. There were over 700 that they reviewed, I remember, but only 13 of us were able to test. We didn't even meet until we all passed.
What tests did you have to pass?
Oh, there were a lot. They were kind of weird too, but it was worth the chance to go into space. I remember once they froze our ears to mimic vertigo to see how fast we recovered. That was all in phase 1. There were other phases after, and only few of us could make it.
How would these tests compare to NASA tests?
NASA tests their astronauts, men of course, in groups, which means there are all sorts of misinformation in their results. We did just as well, did you know that? But it still wasn't until much later that women were allowed to even apply to NASA. There was a Russian woman piloting a space shuttle in 1963, and NASA was still adamant that women could not handle space until around the 1970s at least.